My friends, history is not written in silence. It is shouted through the roar of missiles and the collapse of empires. What we are witnessing today in Venezuela is not a headline, it is a signal that the old order, led by U.S. dominance, is trembling at its core. The world's balance of power is shifting, and once again, the empire finds itself challenged, this time not by words, but by the unmistakable presence of Russian missiles in Latin America. Venezuela's defiance did not erupt overnight. It has been brewing for years, built on layers of political humiliation, economic suffocation, and relentless U.S. pressure. What we are witnessing now is not merely a diplomatic shift or a military maneuver, it is the roar of a nation reclaiming its dignity. For too long, Washington viewed Venezuela as a failed experiment, a pawn on its geopolitical chessboard. But suddenly, that pawn has turned into a queen, moving strategically and unpredictably, backed by none other than Moscow's might. The move has caught Western analysts off guard. Yet for those who have studied the patterns of empire and resistance, this was inevitable. The turning point came when Caracas finally realized that economic survival and national sovereignty could no longer be separated. U.S. sanctions had crippled Venezuela's oil exports, the lifeblood of its economy. Inflation soared, industries collapsed, and the people suffered not just from economic mismanagement, but from calculated external strangulation. The U.S. believed that through economic isolation, it could engineer a regime change. But the policy backfired. It pushed Venezuela straight into the arms of America's most formidable rival, Russia. This defiance is not just political theater, it is deeply symbolic. When President Nicolas Maduro stood beside Russian officials welcoming military cooperation and missile defense systems, it was a declaration that Venezuela will no longer kneel to U.S. intimidation. The sight of Russian hardware arriving in a region long considered America's backyard sent shockwaves through Washington's establishment. The unspoken rule of the Monroe Doctrine that no rival power should operate in the Western Hemisphere had just been broken. The geopolitical chessboard shifted overnight. What makes this moment historically powerful is that Venezuela is not acting out of reckless ambition. It is acting out of necessity, driven by survival instincts and an understanding of global realignment. The world today is not the world of the 1990s, where U.S. power reigned unchallenged. We live in a multipolar environment where nations like Russia, China, and Iran offer economic and military alternatives to Washington's conditional aid and diplomatic coercion. Venezuela's defiance, therefore, is part of a larger pattern, a wave of nations refusing to be dictated to, no matter the cost. There's also an undeniable element of psychological warfare here. By aligning with Russia, Caracas is sending a loud message not just to the U.S. government, but to other Latin American states that have quietly suffered under the weight of American influence. It's saying you can resist, you can choose independence, and you won't be alone. This message resonates deeply across a continent with a long memory of U.S.-backed coups, interventions, and economic manipulation. Venezuela's defiance has reignited a dormant sense of regional solidarity, a collective reminder that sovereignty still has meaning, even in a world dominated by superpowers. The U.S. media will frame this as provocation, as instability, as a reckless gamble by a desperate regime. But in truth, this defiance is an assertion of agency. It is Venezuela reclaiming its voice in a global dialogue that has long silenced it. The introduction of Russian missiles is not an act of aggression, it's a deterrent. A message that the era of unilateral military intimidation is coming to an end. For years, U.S. warships patrolled near Venezuelan waters with impunity, flexing power under the banner of freedom of navigation. Now, the equation has changed. those warships may soon think twice before venturing too close. Beneath the military posturing lies a deeper narrative, one of economic rebellion. Venezuela's partnership with Russia extends beyond arms deals. It includes energy cooperation, technological exchange, and financial systems designed to bypass the U.S. dominated dollar trade. This is how resistance evolves in the 21st century, not through direct confrontation, but through economic innovation and strategic partnerships that undermine imperial leverage. Each missile, each trade agreement, each handshake between Caracas and Moscow chips away at the myth of American omnipotence. For the first time in decades, Latin America's voice echoes on the global stage, not as a subordinate, but as a challenger. Venezuela's defiance may be risky, it may be costly, but it is undeniably transformative. It has shattered the illusion of U.S. control and redefined what it means for a small nation to stand tall in a world of giants. The message is clear and electrifying. Sovereignty is no longer negotiable, and Venezuela will no longer bow to the empire's script. When the first reports surfaced that Russian missile systems were being deployed near Venezuela's coast, the global media erupted, but the deeper meaning of this move goes far beyond military hardware. It represents a tectonic shift in the balance of power, a calculated and deliberate challenge to U.S. naval supremacy in the Caribbean. For decades, the United States operated in this region with absolute impunity, its warships patrolling international waters as visible reminders of American dominance. But now, with Russian missiles positioned within striking range, that dominance faces a direct and unmistakable threat. The symbolism is as powerful as the weaponry itself. This is no longer America's uncontested ocean. The parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis are impossible to ignore. Yet this is not 1962. The geopolitical conditions have evolved, and so have the actors involved. Unlike Cuba during the Cold War, Venezuela's decision to host Russian weaponry is not born from ideological allegiance, but from strategic necessity. Decades of sanctions, economic siege, and diplomatic isolation have pushed Caracas to embrace any partnership that ensures its survival. For Russia, this deployment is a masterstroke, an opportunity to project power into Washington's own neighborhood while sending a clear message. The age of unilateral American control is over. The missiles themselves, whether defensive systems like the S-400 or offensive cruise variants, are not just tools of deterrence. They are political instruments reshaping perceptions of vulnerability. The U.S. Navy, long accustomed to operating freely near Latin American shores, now faces a sobering new reality. Any aggressive maneuver could be met with an equal and opposite show of force. The Caribbean, once considered a safe staging ground for U.S. power projection, has become contested space. Every radar ping, every naval exercise, every satellite image now carries new weight. Inside Washington, this move has triggered quiet panic. Military planners and policymakers are confronting a nightmare scenario, a hostile alliance taking root within the Western Hemisphere, undermining the Monroe Doctrine's unspoken promise that the Americas would remain under U.S. influence. The irony is bitter. While American officials accused Moscow of escalation, it was Washington's own policies that paved the way. Years of economic warfare against Venezuela, relentless attempts to isolate Russia, and the expansion of NATO toward Moscow's borders have collectively produced the very alliance the U.S. now fears. For Russia, the deployment serves multiple purposes. It allows Moscow to demonstrate that U.S. pressure can and will be reciprocated. When NATO missiles appear in Eastern Europe or near Russia's borders, the Kremlin can now respond in kind, positioning its technology within reach of U.S. assets. This symmetry redefines deterrence in a multipolar age. Moreover, it sends a signal to Russia's allies and potential partners: Moscow is not merely a regional power, it is a global actor capable of shaping outcomes anywhere on the map. For countries under U.S. sanctions, this is more than symbolic, it's a promise of protection. The visual impact is undeniable. Russian missile launchers on Venezuelan soil, naval technicians working alongside local military officers, and radar stations scanning the horizon. All of it conveys defiance, confidence, and control. It transforms Venezuela's image from a struggling, isolated state into a frontline player in a broader geopolitical struggle. And for millions across Latin America, long accustomed to seeing their region as a passive stage for U.S. operations, it ignites a new sense of possibility that even the most powerful empire can be challenged when alliances are built on mutual interest instead of subservience. The U.S. response so far has been cautious but tense. Diplomatic warnings, intelligence assessments, and veiled threats have filled official statements, yet there is an underlying recognition that direct military confrontation would be disastrous. The American public, wary from years of foreign wars, would not support another escalation, especially one so close to home. Meanwhile, global audiences are watching closely. In Moscow and Beijing, policymakers see vindication. In Washington, strategists see exposure. Beyond the hardware and strategy lies a deeper transformation, the psychological impact of vulnerability. For generations, the U.S. projected power outward, never fearing retaliation within its sphere of influence. That illusion has now shattered. Each missile, each radar installation on Venezuelan soil is a reminder that U.S. dominance can be mirrored, that intimidation can flow both ways. The Caribbean, once the quiet periphery of American might, has become a flashpoint in the unfolding drama of multipolar power. The deployment of Russian missiles in Venezuela marks more than a military event. It is a declaration of equality in defiance. It says to Washington, your monopoly on force is over. It says to the world, the game has changed. This is geopolitical theater at its most intense, where symbolism and strategy collide, and where a small nation, long dismissed as irrelevant, now stands as the stage upon which global power recalibrates itself. The echo of this moment will travel far beyond the Caribbean. It will reverberate through every capital where nations question whether the old empire still holds the right to command the world. The concept of American power has long rested on the belief that the United States can project strength across every continent, on land, sea, and air, simultaneously and indefinitely. Yet today, that belief is being tested as never before. The empire that once moved with precision and authority now shows visible strain. Every front, from Europe to the Middle East to the Pacific, demands its attention, its resources, and its credibility. The global overstretch of U.S. power has become not just a military challenge, but a political and moral one. It is the inevitable fatigue of a superpower that has tried to dominate too much for too long without recalibrating its purpose. The cracks are everywhere. In Eastern Europe, the prolonged conflict in Ukraine has drained Washington's strategic bandwidth. Billions of dollars flow into a war with no clear endgame, while domestic infrastructure crumbles and political divisions deepen at home. Across the Pacific, U.S. naval fleets maneuver through the South China Sea, trying to contain Beijing's rise. But the reality is inescapable. China's economic and military capacity has surpassed the point where it can be contained. In the Middle East, a new wave of instability has erupted as alliances shift. Oil routes are threatened, and Washington's traditional partners question the value of its promises. Every region now demands more than the U.S. can realistically provide. This overstretch is not just military, it's economic. The American dollar, long the cornerstone of global trade, faces mounting challenges from BRICS nations building alternative financial systems. Sanctions, once a weapon of coercion, have lost much of their bite as nations find creative ways to trade outside the U.S. banking structure. The very tools of dominance, military bases, sanctions, aid conditions, are now weakening from overuse. The United States, once the undisputed conductor of global affairs, is increasingly reacting instead of leading, chasing crises it can no longer control. The deeper danger lies in perception. Across the world, nations are watching the United States struggle to sustain multiple conflicts and commitments, and they are drawing conclusions. They see a superpower that can no longer impose its will without resistance, a power that relies more on memory than on momentum. The aura of invincibility that defined post-Cold War America has faded. Each new confrontation exposes not dominance but dependence on borrowed money, on private contractors, on alliances that grow more fragile with every misstep. Venezuela's defiance and Russia's presence in the Caribbean are not isolated provocations. They are symptoms of this overstretch. When Washington threatens sanctions or military retaliation, its words no longer carry the same deterrent weight. The world has learned that the U.S. cannot be everywhere at once, that its attention is finite, and that its political system is paralyzed by partisanship. This awareness emboldens others to act, to test boundaries, to push back where they once would have yielded. The empire's greatest weakness, ironically, is its own exhaustion. Inside the Pentagon, strategists speak of readiness and resilience, but behind the technical language lies a deeper anxiety. The United States must now balance deterrence in Europe, reassurance in Asia, and crisis management in the Middle East, all while maintaining domestic political legitimacy. It is a juggling act no empire in history has sustained for long. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, each fell not from invasion, but from the slow erosion of capacity, overextension, and internal decay. History whispers its warning, but Washington seems deaf to the sound. The political consequences are equally profound as voters grow wary of endless wars and trillion-dollar defense budgets. Domestic priorities like healthcare, education, and infrastructure remain underfunded. The American public is questioning why its prosperity must be sacrificed for distant conflicts. Every foreign intervention now faces growing skepticism. Every military budget faces sharper scrutiny. The once united front of American globalism is fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. What makes this moment historic is that the overstretch is not temporary, it is structural. The United States built a system of global control dependent on perpetual expansion, but the world has changed. Emerging powers are asserting their autonomy. Technology is redistributing influence, and information flows have eroded propaganda monopolies. America's military might still dwarfs that of any single rival, but combined, the new coalition of nations, Russia, China, Iran, and their allies, creates a strategic complexity that no amount of hardware can solve. The overstretch is, in essence, the story of an empire facing its limits. It is the fatigue of a power that mistook dominance for destiny, that believed control could substitute for cooperation. The United States remains powerful, but no longer unchallenged. Every new crisis, from the Ukrainian front to the Caribbean waters, reveals a nation fighting on too many fronts with too little coherence. The question is no longer whether the U.S. can respond. It's how long it can sustain the illusion that it can respond to everything. The world is shifting, and even the mightiest empire cannot hold the center forever. The 21st century is no longer defined by a single center of power. It is an unfolding contest among several. What we are seeing today is not just a shift in alliances or a new round of diplomatic posturing. It is the birth of a multipolar world, a fundamental restructuring of global order. The United States, once the uncontested hegemon, now faces rivals that do not merely challenge its dominance, they rewrite the rules entirely. The emergence of this new system has been gradual, yet unstoppable, driven by a shared determination among nations to end the era of unilateral control. The voices once silenced by economic pressure and military intimidation are beginning to speak in unison, crafting a global chorus of independence. At the heart of this transformation lies a new understanding of power. No longer is power measured solely by military strength or nuclear stockpiles. It now resides in economic connectivity, technological innovation, and the ability to forge genuine partnerships. The rise of China as a global economic giant, the resurgence of Russia as a military and energy power, and the growing assertiveness of regional blocs like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization all point to one undeniable truth. The world is no longer willing to orbit around Washington's axis. Each of these players brings its own model of influence, its own vision for global cooperation, and together they are constructing a counterbalance to Western dominance that is both sophisticated and strategic. The recent alliances forming across continents are more than mere tactical moves. They are declarations of intent. When Venezuela partners with Russia, when Iran deepens its ties with China, when African nations sign trade deals that bypass the US dollar, they are not just conducting business, they are engaging in a quiet revolution against the existing world order. The language of compliance is being replaced by the language of sovereignty. Nations long dismissed as developing or unstable are now key architects of a new financial and political architecture designed to redistribute power more evenly. This is not chaos, it is evolution. The US and its allies, accustomed to controlling the narrative, now find themselves reacting to a global shift they can no longer dictate. Sanctions that once crippled economies are losing their potency as alternative financial systems emerge. Trade once monopolized by Western institutions is being rerouted through new corridors that connect Asia, Africa, and Latin America directly. The creation of BRICS financial mechanisms, the expansion of digital currencies, and the integration of energy cooperation agreements are all pieces of a larger mosaic, a world where no single power can dominate the flow of capital, information, or influence. The Western media frames this as fragmentation, as if the decline of US dominance automatically means disorder. But in reality, it reflects a more balanced global reality. Nations are simply reclaiming what globalization promised but never delivered: mutual respect and self-determination. The rise of multipolarity does not mean the fall of America. It means the end of America's monopoly on decision-making. The shift is profound because it undermines the ideological foundation of Western supremacy, the belief that liberal capitalism backed by U.S. military power represents the only path to progress. The rest of the world has seen that model falter under debt crisis, endless wars, and political dysfunction, and it is now choosing its own way forward. The psychological impact of this new order cannot be overstated. For decades, the global South looked to Washington, London, or Brussels for approval and aid. Today, it looks to Beijing, Moscow, or Delhi for partnership. This psychological independence is as revolutionary as any military development. It marks a turning point where nations are no longer defined by dependency, but by strategic self-interest. The result is a web of interconnections that makes unilateral action nearly impossible. Every move now carries global consequences. Every decision requires dialogue rather than decree. In this new world, power is distributed, not concentrated. The United States remains influential, but it is now one voice among many. The old empire's authority has been replaced by negotiation, and even coercion must wear the mask of cooperation. The more Washington resists this reality, the more isolated it becomes. Meanwhile, multipolarity opens opportunities for smaller nations to shape regional policies, leverage resources, and assert their interests without fear of domination. The world is no longer watching the superpowers dictate the story, it is writing its own narrative. This birth of a multipolar world is not without tension, but it carries an undeniable energy, a sense that history is being rewritten in real time. The alliances forming today will define the next century. The United States may still possess unmatched firepower, but the moral and strategic gravity of the world is shifting elsewhere. The global stage no longer has a single spotlight, it has many. And under each of those lights, nations once dismissed as peripheral are stepping forward, ready to take their place in the new script of global power. The age of one empire's command is fading. The age of shared influence has begun, whether the old order accepts it or not. Empires fall not when they are defeated, but when they are denied obedience. And tonight, Venezuela just said no to empire loudly, clearly, and with missiles pointed at the sky.